Good morning, good day, good afternoon, dear friends, colleagues, and the guests of this seminar. My name is Natalia Khanenko-Friesen. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the concluding seminar in our celebrated series, The Rethinking Ukrainian Environment, War, Ecocide, and Beyond, that we had collaborated on together with the Ukrainian Environmental History Research Group here at the University of Alberta on the basis of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. Welcome also to the Treaty 6 territory. This is the land of Indigenous peoples, Métis people, and others, from where I'm connecting with you today. The seminar series we have started in the fall of 2025 together with our colleagues in the Ukrainian Environmental History Research Group. It aims to address the gap in scholarship, in our general knowledge about the fate of the relationship between humans, non-humans, and the environment in Ukraine. And of course, in the context of the ongoing brutal war, which was launched, the full-scale invasion of which we have witnessed to start in February 2022, exacerbates the importance of our conversations in this series. I'm very pleased to welcome you to what is shaping up to be a concluding seminar this academic year to today's presentation. But I also wanted to mention that in particular today's presentation, because it also has a focus on historical events of almost 100 years ago, the initiative also bridges conversations in another area of studies, Holodomor studies. And as all know, Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies have been pioneering or has been amongst the pioneers in supporting the development of the field of the Holodomor studies. In our own Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, much has been done. A lot of research has been done. Many publications have been produced. But importantly, I also want to bring your attention to the recently launched massive open online course on the Holodomor, which is currently available at the University of Alberta on the globally known and recognized educational platform Coursera. The massive open online course, the MOOC, so-called MOOC, titled Famine is Genocide, the Holodomor in Ukraine. It's a 13-module course delivered in a very engaging way. These are 13 educational videos which you will appreciate but also enjoy watching. So I encourage you to sign up and start perusing those materials, either for your own sake or if you're a professor, teacher, for those who you educate. Without much ado, I would like to welcome my dear colleague, Anna Olenenko, who is that force behind the seminar series and who will continue on introducing today's event. Anu, thank you so much. Anna Olenenko.
Thank you so much, Natalia, for this introduction. So welcome everyone to our seminars, Rethinking Ukraine's Environment, War, Ecocide, and Beyond. As Natalia has already mentioned, that this initiative is a collaborative effort of NFHTA Research Group and Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, who are hosting this seminar series. And also we have a long partnership with our partners in Europe, Center for Baltic and East European Studies at Södertörn University in Sweden, Center for Governance and Culture in Europe, University of St. Gallen in Switzerland, and European Society for Environmental History. So my name is Anna and I will be moderating today's seminar. So I would like to say that during our previous seminars in this series, we explored different historical perspectives on human-environment interactions in Ukraine. We discussed ecocide, waste and epidemics, animals in times of war, as well as indigenous and local environmental knowledge. Today, we gather to discuss another important topic, the Holodomor and the environment. For those who are in Ukrainian studies, it is not the news that there is already a substantial body of research on the Holodomor, including books, articles, published historical sources, etc. Entire institutions have dedicated significant efforts to uncovering the history of the Holodomor. But today, together with our speakers, we will approach the Holodomor from a different perspective. We will explore how environmental history history, how human and environment relations and the non-human world can be included in this conversation. So let me introduce briefly our speakers. John Vsetecka. He is assistant professor of history at Nova Southeastern University in Florida. John is a scholar of East European and Soviet history with a specific interest in the history of Ukraine. His research and writing focus on the history of famine, mass violence, and transitional justice. John is finishing his book entitled In the Wake of Hunger, Confronting the Legacies of the 1932-1933 Famine, Holodomor in Soviet Ukraine during the 1930s. He is also a co-editor of the Holodomor in Global Perspective, which was published in February 2026. And also John is a founder of H Ukraine, which is the part of the larger HNet platform, which shares and promotes academic and scholarly content related to the study of Ukraine. Our next presenter is Iryna Skubii. She's a historian of Ukraine, the Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe. She's an inaugural Mykola Zero Fellow in Ukrainian Studies, and Senior Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne, and the President of the Ukrainian Studies Association of Australia and New Zealand. Iryna's research explores economic, social, and environmental history with a focus on food, famine, agriculture, material culture, and memory. Iryna is the author of Trade in Kharkiv in the Years of NEP, Economy and Everyday Life, and also she is completing her second monograph, Famine Ecologists and Famine Materiality, Human and Non-Human Survival in Soviet Ukraine. She is also a co-author of the book Holodomor, 1932-1933 Famine in Ukraine, with Cambridge University Press. So a couple of words about the format. We will have two speakers, and after speakers, we will have Q&A session. Feel free to put your questions in the Q&A section or chat. You don't need to wait until the end of the speakers' presentations. So let's start. John, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much to Anna and to Qs and to everybody else for the invitation to speak. It's really an honor to be speaking here, but also, alongside my colleague Iryna, who is, a colleague and a friend in the world of Holodomor studies. And I'm particularly grateful to be giving this talk and to be in dialogue with all of you, not only about the Holodomor, but after the past few days of violence in Ukraine and the destruction of the environment. After these attacks, I've been thinking a lot about this and the relationship that humans have to the environment. And so I think it's a worthwhile conversation to be speaking about the past, about the Holodomor, but also about the connections of the past to the present, which I think are painfully loud right now. So my talk today is titled Mourning the Fields That Feed, Environment and Trauma in the Wake of the Holodomor. And this talk today is it is geared towards my research on the sort of immediate aftermath of the Holodomor and the intersections that my research has with environmental history. So one of the things that I want to talk about today is just, I'll start by sort of, I think, briefing you that I am not really a historian of the environment, but of course, I interact with the environment in my research. It is present within the context of what I study. And of course, I am, I'm in deep gratitude to my colleagues like Iryna, also people like Daria Tsimbalyuk, who have written extensively on the environment in Ukraine and have really, after reading their work, have sort of helped me understand where I might speak about the environment and what I can offer today about the intersections of the aftermath of famine, the aftermath of the Holodomor, and the environment. So I think to break this down today, what I want to start by doing is just highlighting the importance of studying the sort of aftermath of famine, which is the world that I live in. My first book, forthcoming, I think in about 2027, so about a year, is about the way that Ukrainians, grapple with the effects of the aftermath of the Holodomor, from the end of the famine in 1933 up until the end of the 1930s and really the start of the Second World War. And within the legacies of the famine, I highlight that these, resonating effects really are a central preoccupation in the aftermath. And really, the famine in many ways does not go away. And this is what my book is about. There are a number of things that we have to deal with, that the state has to deal with, and that those who are, fortunate to survive the famine also have to grapple with. And so what I want to do today is sort of highlight and give you a taste of what that research looks like, but also start to situate the environmental history of the Holodomor into that space of the aftermath of famine. And I want to look into the ways that, or look at the ways I should say that the physical environment becomes altered, the way that humans have, a sort of changed relationship or understanding of the environment around them. And again, this is, of course, what Iryna will talk about. The environment can also be a savior in this moment. I know Iryna's work talks about this, the sort of foods that are available, or the animals that are available, the non-human actors, these types of things. But what I will look at today is a little bit darker. It is about the way in which complete altered landscapes become part of the milieu in the aftermath of famine. And what I will sort of end and sort of gesture to throughout today is really, how Ukraine's environment really becomes a tool for processing famine-related traumas and the way in which the environment starts to become a way that those who survive the famine work to come to terms with what has happened. And I will give some examples from my research where I see this present. So one of the things that I always sort of speak about first, and it's a dark topic, of course, is the dead. It is about the bodies, the corpses in the aftermath of the famine. This, of course, is one of the most obvious and visible signs of the Holodomor in Ukraine. It's the millions of dead bodies that are really scattered apart every part of Soviet Ukraine in 1932 and 1933 and beyond. And this is something, of course, that shows up in all of the sources, but this makes up the first chapter of my book. It's called Corporal Confrontations, and it's about a sensory history of encountered environments in Ukraine and what it means to confront the dead in the sort of immediate aftermath of the famine and what these encounters tell us, right? It has an intersection with necropolitics, the fundamental understanding of the dead by Akil Mbembe, an African theorist who talks about the way in which necropolitics, right, is about who gets to live and who gets to die. And in Ukraine, of course, those like Stalin and others who implement this, man-made famine, this genocidal famine against Ukrainians, essentially strip the ability of Ukrainians to live or to control their own death in a sort of natural way. And what happens then is, of course, we have millions of dead across Ukraine, and this reflects what I would argue is an altered, environment. It's a reality of violence, of forced starvation, and what it does is it puts the dead into spaces, into Ukrainian environments where they're not normally at, where they should not be, right? On streets, on roads, in markets, both, in the urban environments, but also in the rural ones, as well as other public spaces. And these corporal confrontations really, if we start to look at the sources, give us a really rich sensory history of what it was like to confront the totality of this changed environment, both during and immediately after the famine. So one of the things too, I think that, if we're going to talk about the environment in a sort of general sense, right, it can be, of course, about animals and it can be about, fields and rivers and streams. And I will get to this kind of thing, but also just everyday environments, lived environments is something that we also need to consider. And I think that, one of the things about the famine is, confronting the dead becomes a very unnatural environment for Ukrainians and just anybody in general who has to experience this. The bodies are literally everywhere. Those of you who are familiar with the Holodomor, of course, have seen at the Alexander Wienerberger collection, in which there are a number of photos of the dead, and there are others, that sort of speak to this as well. But what it gives us is a sort of new history or new understanding of the disrupted experience of trying to move on. Even after the famine is over, there's still a number of corpses, in these public spaces that people stop and look at. I mean, you see an example here of a crowd looking at one of these bodies. Really, of course, it's a sign of the famine, but it's a sign of a violated moral order, right, that is struck down on Ukraine. And of course, Ukrainians have to pay the price for this. So I think too, in my work, one of the things that I pay attention to, are the multi-sensory experiences of seeing the bodies, what this means, having to confront them, literally stepping over them, physically picking them up, the sort of corporal confrontations that I spoke about earlier. Also, of course, the olfactory sense, right? The sense of smell. This is present in a lot of the sources too. The decomposition, and this is also in the literature. And this too, right? If we pay attention to the senses, is a broader reflection of the breakdown of a society due to forced famine. You also have other experiences too, the sounds of trucks and the carts moving the bodies. A lot of survivors talk about this and what this did, hearing those screeches of the wheels coming to pick up the dead, or you hear the engines in the middle of the night coming to remove those bodies. This too triggered something in the sort of sensory factor, right? And this too disrupted the environment. And there's also other, aspects to the sounds of, shovels digging mass graves. And this too is a direct confrontation with the environment, which I'll talk about a little bit more. But I start with bodies just to talk about the dead is so overwhelming. When you have millions of people that die so quickly, right? Particularly in the spring of 1933, some, just shy of 30,000 people a day or more, as we still sort of figure out an exact number of the millions who died. This is an unnatural reflection of a changed environment. And I would argue that confronting these bodies was one of the first ways that those who survive really feel that impact of a whole changed country, a changed environment, right? In which all of a sudden you're going about your daily life, but you're also encountering the dead. This is not a natural thing. Now, one of the other issues too with this that we have to consider is the sort of physical transformation of the environment as it relates to the dead. Um, of course, one of the aspects of mass violence and, famines, of course, are included in this, and we need to do more to sort of put that in the literature. Famines are not always understood as part of genocides, but of course, the Holodomor gives us this great sort of example of how this, can exist. The environments are altered by the dead in different ways as well. And so one of the things we need to pay attention to are the mass graves, right? That become a sort of resting place. Some are temporary, some are permanent resting places for those millions of bodies who get thrown into these, what they call fraternal graves, but really mass graves that the Soviets, sort of create in order to dispose and hide and get rid of the evidence of what has happened. And what happens then is with these mass graves, the environments also around cities, and we're still sort of finding these graves. And in fact, we had a great discussion about this in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago when we heard a great talk at the Holodomor Legacy Initiative from a forensic archaeologist that gave our community the sort of tools and ideas about how we might start to confront these changed landscapes and begin, to consider exhumations to, get a better understanding of how many people died and these types of things. And it gave us a lot of food for thought. But what I want to sort of stress here is that these non-cemetery spaces, these mass graves that are put up all over Ukraine, they're not just burial grounds, but they're forced change environments, literal changes, to the soil, to the gravel, right, to the steps, these types of things. And I would argue that these pits, these burial sites, they do disrupt Ukrainian forms of burial and last rites and religious ceremonies and remembrance. And in this way, the environment acts as a sort of, moment of trauma in which the environment that Ukrainians would have to, use to bury their dead, that ability to do that on your own, to give them, a proper funeral is stripped from so many. Now, one of the other things I think we need to pay attention to, and this is something that we have a lot more work to do in the archives, and I know this because I've worked in a lot of the, central archives in Ukraine, but also the regional ones. We have a number of records that tell us about these mass grave sites and what happens to them afterwards. So if you go to Ukraine, and I know many of you here are familiar with the Holodomor and maybe have visited some of these mass grave sites, one of the things that happens with these mass graves is it changes the sort of soil complexion, right? It makes it kind of sandy on top. So even though environments will reclaim that land naturally, and there's something to be said about, what the environment will do, the environment doesn't care what humans do. It sort of moves on itself and, will reclaim its territory. These mass graves have a sort of complexion due to not only the bodies that are buried there, but the Soviets also used mass amounts of lime, right, on these bodies to help them sort of decay faster and help with the smell of decomposition and these types of things. And what this does is it changes the soil and it changes the actual environment in Ukraine as a result of this. Now, after these graves were done, some of them were left intact. Others were completely removed. And what I mean by that is that these grave sites in places where we have millions of dead bodies are intentionally covered up by the Soviet regime. We have archival records. For example, I was working in the archives in Kharkiv, and they have a bunch of documents in which the Soviets tell us directly that they cover up these mass graves with places or with green spaces like parks, just some other various green spaces, but also industrial sites. And in fact, there's some interesting documents that talk about a couple of industrial centers that were built on shaky ground, and one of the pillars of this industrial site outside of Kharkiv actually crumbled because it was unstable soil, and when they, it sort of propped up the grave that had been built underneath. And so it makes me pause and think about the sort of environmental factors that are there and what we have left. There's so many sites of mass graves from the Holodomor that are covered by other things. And this includes urban centers in Kyiv. And I'll talk a little bit about where some of these exist today and how you can go visit them, in your own way. But really what this does too is these mass graves are not just for the dead. I think we have to think a little bit deeper about this. This is a changed environment. It's a sign of denial, but what it is it's a sign of the Soviet regime, but of course, in this continuation now the Russian Federation, which is taking some moves out of the 1930s and beyond in what they're doing today to really reimagine Ukraine's landscape. And of course, I didn't mean that in a positive way. What I mean is to reimagine a Ukraine that can exist in their world, which is a non-existent Ukraine, right? And if you reimagine the environment and you reimagine the fact that in their eyes, the famine doesn't happen in Ukraine, right? Not at least in the way that we understand the Holodomor, it's a way of getting rid of it. And so getting rid of the famine is not just propaganda, but it's also about reimagining and disintegrating the Ukrainian environment. And it's something that I think we have to, think about, but also something that the Holodomor gives us as a lesson and insight. Now, to continue on with this theme, before I sort of transition to some other discussions about the way the environment sort of, becomes present in the aftermath, there's also a moment of hope here. And as somebody who works on transitional justice, which is what my second book is about, I think that these altered environments, we can also look at them in a different way. So just like the Soviets sort of, reimagined the environment by trying to build these green spaces and parks over these mass graves, Ukrainians, at least to a small degree, have been able to sort of reclaim the environments through the dead in these other ways. So, for example, this too is outside of Kharkiv in 2005. It's a reburial of some Holodomor victims. And these reburials are an important moment for justice. It forces confrontations with the land, but it also helps those who survived the famine, those who are living, to begin some of these exhumations, to put these bodies in proper coffins, to give them a ceremony. You can see the priest here giving blessings before there's a reburial. Before there's markers of graves in which families and others can actually return to these sites, right, and pay their respects, which is something that, was stripped from so many. This too is a new confrontation of the environment, having to reconfront the bodies, having to reconfront the graves, but it's also a moment of justice. And so I would say that, within this confrontation of bodies now, it looks a little bit different. And I think, of course, there's a lot more work to do, but these reburials are a new confrontation, not only with, the remains of those who died during the famine, but also the environment. And this is a form of environmental justice in which reclaiming that land for proper burials, for proper use, for proper remembrance, is a moment in which Ukrainians are starting to restore moral order. And so, I don't want to say that this is, a positive thing. There's nothing positive about death and famine and genocide, but there are moments perhaps of hope in which the environment serves, as a sort of reclamation point for Ukrainians in which they now control the environment on their own terms, despite, not having that ability to do so before. Now, I want to turn to another example in my talk, and I don't want to take up too much time because I want to give time for Iryna's talk and questions, of course. Is I just want to give you another perspective of where I see this environmental trauma taking place in my sort of field of the aftermath. And I think too that one of the things that stuck out to me after working in the archives, particularly in the SBU archive and others, is the way that the environment starts to pop up in conversations and in literature and in poems, say between 1933 and 1938, from those who survived the famine, particularly college-age students, which I have a chapter on in my book as well. And I also have an article that you can read on this. Um, so what I want to sort of give to you now in the last few slides here is some examples of the way in which Ukrainians start to mourn the environment through literary devices, through poetry. And I'll show you a couple examples of poetry that I found in the archives from those who survived the famine, but in the aftermath of 1933. And really, some of these poems are written in 1933, 34, 35, 36, and so on. They become problematic as they become discussed in public spaces to some degree. And these poems say a lot about all aspects of the famine, and some of which I've talked about before. But what they really tell us actually is the way in which the environment is used as a sort of moment, as a sort of literary device, as a metaphor to work through the traumas that still exist after 1933. And I think these are particularly important. The poems, of course, are very interesting on their own. They give us a sort of inlet to the private lives of those who survived and what they're thinking about, and also the coded language that they have to use to talk about the famine, also the horrors through which they lived. But it's also a sort of counter narrative, right? A counter archive, as Karolina Kocyra talks about in some of her work. It gives us, from the viewpoint of Ukrainians, their understanding and perspective of what it means to confront the famine. And of course, when you confront a famine, you have to confront the environment, which they do. So here's one example here. Um, this is a part of one of the poems, and I've translated it into English here, is that the environmental language is used in a number of different ways in some of these poems to talk about things like collectivization and, theft of property, theft of food, theft of culture, and things like this, and also perpetrators, right? So if you know Daria Mattingly's work, she focuses on these sort of perpetrator interactions. And this poem here is from one individual, college-age student, Yakov Markovich, who wrote this poem in 1933 and got, arrested as a result of this in I think it was 1936 or 1937, in which he wrote a number of poems about the Holodomor. And he uses this environmental language to talk about perpetrators and what they do to the villages, the collectivization. And you can see from some of these stanzas what he talks about. So he talks about, a violent wind. He talks about the blowing and howling of these two brigade leaders, Demyan and Kuzmich, looking for the bread and stealing the bread. Uses these environmental metaphors of the wind and the storm to talk about these perpetrators, and use this environmental language to talk about them and to describe them as something, otherworldly and beyond human, right? And to talk about how powerful these brigades were in stealing from those individuals. It's also interesting too, because in some of these poems, that language continues on, and we also see examples of comparing some of these perpetrators to animals. And in this case, in one of the stanzas, he calls them jackals, and others he talks about them being mice that are stealing, and they're scavengers, and that, they're not part of the traditional Ukrainian environment that is helping Ukraine become independent, which he talks about in a different stanza. And I think that this language is really interesting because a lot of this poem is working through perhaps what was a very real experience for him. It's unclear, right? There are some stand-ins in his poems. We don't know exactly if this happened to him or if he just witnessed it or if it was a general experience. But these environmental descriptions, give some pause for us to think about the way in which the environment can be used to describe these individuals. But also, I think too, some of the animal metaphors, and this is in some of the literature on, poetry and genocide and violence, is that the confrontation of describing these perpetrators as animals is a way to describe them as partly non-human, but it's also, I think, it's a way to circumnavigate direct confrontation with these perpetrators because they don't actually know how to describe it, right? It's hard to think that another human, and perhaps another Ukrainian stole from me, right? Or somebody did this to me. And this too is a way of working through this process of trauma, trying to figure out who did this trauma to me, and working through this. And part of that trauma experience, right? If we know something about trauma, it's the inability to move forward from that past, right? It's that sort of mental inability to do so. And part of that is working through the construction of that trauma. And we see this in the poems here. There's one more example that I'll talk about. And this comes from a different individual who was writing poetry about the famine. And also, this one is a little bit more geared toward the environment, talking about the destruction of the field, right? And this is what I would call, where we're mourning the fields that feed. This is somebody who is not necessarily talking about perpetrators now, but talking about the tarnished or, desecrated Ukrainian environment in which the once glowing gold fields of wheat are now black and dry and barren, right? Because it's been stolen, right? It was a colonial extraction of grain out of Ukraine to the bins of Moscow that then sells it abroad at an increased price. The individual here, Rokhovenko's poem from July of 1933, I think shows this environmental mourning, talking about the fields and the ocean of ears that are agitated. And it's also a description, too, of this individual literally sitting next to these fields and watching the environment decay while they're also dying, right? So they see themselves perhaps as attached or part of that environment. And when that environment is violated, the environment dies, and perhaps so do them because because they're part of this environment. And so, I think that there's a lot more work to be done, but these are just a couple of examples of where the environment shows up in these recollections of the famine and the aftermath and how people are dealing with that. So just to conclude here, I think, there's also this moment in the present, which we're still dealing with the confrontations of environmental trauma in Ukraine as a result of the Holodomor. And for those of you who don't have this, and I always plug this because I use it in my classes when I teach for my students, there's a great app called Tracking the Holodomor, and you can get it from the App Store on, Apple or, Samsung, whatever you have. And what it does is it has these sort of pre-designed walking tours in Kyiv. And I'm working with students in Ukraine right now. We're working on developing a larger app and these actual barcodes in cities across Ukraine that are Holodomor sites. And then you can scan the barcode and sort of understand what that site was for the Holodomor. But one of the things about this app that I think is interesting is it gives you some archival evidence and then what it looks like now. And it helps us confront this environment of, and this is geared towards Kyiv. So on the app, you can go and see perhaps a building or a church, but below it is a mass grave from the famine. And so much of that environment still involves confronting it even in the present. And I think it's a really sort of new, techie, innovative way to understand the environmental history of the Holodomor in a modern sense. So I invite you to look at this app. Students in Ukraine are working on this, and this is really cool, and there's a lot more work to be done. But I thank you very much for your attention. I just want to emphasize, too, that this environmental history, while I'm not an environmental historian, is very much present in these moments of the aftermath. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for your wonderful presentation. I think thank you for bringing those notions of ecological grief and environmental trauma and mourning. I think it's very important, and it can broaden our understanding of Holodomor and how important to understand what is happening with humans when usual landscapes changes. So yeah, thank you so much, John. And now I pass the word to Iryna Skubii.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you so much, everyone, for organizing this series of webinars. And it's really an honor to be a part of this important events and contribute. So I hope you can see my presentation now. So I'm going to talk now and continue talking about environment and animal sensitive histories of famine, but not only. And similar to how John already started, I wanted to pay more attention at how history of Holodomor and other famines could be written and why it's important to develop this environmental history of famine. And before going further, I also wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which I work, learn, and live, because I started this work on the lands of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples territory in Ontario when I was at Queen's University in Kingston, and continued working on this project at University of Melbourne, which is seated on the unceded lands of Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung people and Yorta Nation. And I pay respects to the elders past, present, and future. And this land acknowledgement is not only important in this context of paying justice to colonized and oppressed indigenous people, but also in the context of this webinar, as I'm going to continue talking about land and environment and its meaning during the Soviet famines in Ukraine and the Holodomor in particular. And also I would like to give thanks to the institutions who have worked on this topic at Queen's University in Kingston and also University of Melbourne, but also to Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, whose support was instrumental for my work on this project. And on this particular slide, you can see how famine is a part of the experience of famine contemporaries, how the environment is a part of experience. And we can see how a son of Nikolai Bakhan is pictured sitting in the field in the spot where his brother died in 1933. This is a well-known collection of photos documented by a photographer from Baturin in Chernihiv region, Nikolai Bakhan, about the experience of his family during the Holodomor. And when I started looking at this topic, I noticed that this photo is actually about the environment on which people worked and lived during the famine. And I also started thinking that famine actually here is very present, and famine was not happening somewhere in vacuum, but was taking place in specific political, social, and natural environment. And all of these elements were intertwined in the same time and space. And looking at this photo, we can see how the importance of place and place-based knowledge is really important for understanding the experiences of famine. But also we can continue thinking about the importance of place and land further as we are talking about the colonization of Soviet and Eastern European studies, Ukrainian studies, and also famine studies in particular. So in my presentation, let me try to, yeah. So in my presentation, you can see that there are a set of different questions that I'm trying to pose. And among of them is the main question, is there is a place for the environment in the history of famines? How can we write and speak ethically about such catastrophic events? Because we are here also challenging the main understanding of the famine as human catastrophe, but still how to speak about non-human experiences without diminishing the this catastrophic impact of famine on people, and this especially when we're talking about the Holodomor with several million of people who died during starvation. So this also further forced me to think about how did the environment shape and support human survival practices and change relationship with nature during famine, during these extreme periods of survivals. And thinking like further, we can continue developing this thread of thought and ask ourselves, what do the history of animals, plant, and other species more broadly can tell us about the famine, the Holodomor, as historical event, and how this view that we can name as ground level approach or environmental approach tell us about larger historical events where this famine occurred. And in this context of Holodomor, we can challenge further the context of Soviet modernization, the Soviet collectivization, and how it was conducted on the ground, how it impacted animals and people. And in general, this certainly view could be extended to understanding of the global history of famines, because in the scholarship of famine studies, there are just like also a few studies that are focusing on animal experiences during famine. And my inspiration in this context for scholars who are working on history of famine in Bengal, India. So there is still so much discussion and conversation that should be happening in the context of famine studies if you wanted to develop this field more globally. And here our also key question, if we are approaching this discussion and introducing environmental history approach, is to ask ourselves where the sources come from. Is it possible to develop animal sensitive history? Is it possible to write environmental history of famines, and based on what sources? So when I started looking at this topic, I found that actually we have already so many sources. We just have to change our objects, and there is so much to be done. So here in my presentation, I'm certainly presenting just like a few of such examples. And the history of human-animals relationship is also deeply seated and developed in the context of Ukrainian proverbs, Ukrainian culture. And on this slide in particular, you can see how we can trace animal history and human-animal relations in Ukrainian proverbs. And surprisingly for me, when I started looking into the history of cats and dogs and other domestic animals, that actually many of them are related to history of starvation, to being starving, to being hungry. And here you can see how dogs and cats were particularly related to this experience, to being starving. So some of these examples you can see on the slide, for instance, like to be as hungry as a dog or to have nothing to feed a cat, and certainly so on and so forth. And literary scholars certainly can find more of such examples. So this is a way how we can also again introduce the sources. But also there are lots of state documents, especially on collectivization, about animal-human relationships. And surprisingly, in the context of Soviet history, state paid particular attention to the health of animals. So there are lots of documented sources about this. We can also look at human testimonies, and we have certainly dozens of thousands of these testimonies conducted since the famine, like in particular during 1950s, and this by Harvard Social History Project, but also later since end of 1980s and late 2000s, when many of these oral histories of famine contemporaries are actually saying a lot to us. So again, there is so much to be studied and explored. And also there are lots of visual images about animal experiences, and in particular, again, related to collectivization, to domestic animals, to cattle. So here's a question for us. Why all of these animals and human-animal experiences were unnoticed. And I think like here we have to ask just the right question to our sources. And then would be only the next question, how to write about this history of famine in a sensitive way, which I already mentioned very briefly, and I will try to explain a few of such examples on the sources. When I started working on history of Soviet famines in Ukraine, I've been particularly working with oral history testimonies and looking at survival experiences of people. Certainly what first came to attention is the history of survival thanks to plants. And in this particular testimony that was conducted as a part of the project by American anthropologist William Knoll in 1990s, we can see how Ivan Samsonovich from Poltava region, he is literally saying that his family survived thanks to weeds, and in particular thanks to knowledge of his father about different plants and survival resources in their village and around this area. And he acknowledged that, I quote, I realize how we were able to survive thanks to plants, which gave us all the necessary vitamins and elements. And there are certainly many other similar testimonies and recollections of famine survivors. So many of such sources are available, and many of them are telling very similar stories that would be different if we look into different ecological spaces, depending where people would live in different regions. There would be different plants, but in general, they overwhelmingly would say about different plants as key environmental resources that provided people like food. Also looking at the example of animals, which also another part of my project, I'm looking at the survival experiences of people related to domestic and livestock animals and also wild animals. So looking at three of these groups, we can see how people will using their opportunity for survival thanks to the ability to access this environmental resources or having their domestic animals, they were able to prolong their survival. And this is also should be considered in the context of Soviet planned economy because, again, of forced collectivization that requisitioned those animals from the households and make their survival on these livestock animals impossible. But also many of these animals would be also a part of Soviet planned economy being procured by the state for their different valuable resources like fat or fur. And surprisingly for me, it appears that even dogs and cats were procured for such state campaigns. And as a result of which, there were also the cases of infestation of mice in different villages. So some local authorities have to prohibit such so-called procurements of cats due to these problems. And there are so many of such examples and instances. And again, those details are already in the sources. So if we turn attention from human experiences of collectivization and survival during famines, we can actually see how collectivization and famine were impacting other animals around people. So this allows us to see famine as catastrophe both for people and non-human animals, and actually see how deterioration of economic and environmental conditions were impacting all of them. And in this particular photo, in this particular slide, I put photo which many of you certainly know is from collection of Alexander Wienerberger, engineer who worked in Kharkiv in 1930s, and in his album he documented this photo of malnourished, emaciated horse standing outside in the outskirts in Kharkiv in 1933. And he actually noted in the captions of this photo that animals are also starving. So it's really important to see from the view of this famine contemporary, from the engineer, how actually people were also looking at the starving animals at the time, and also noticing this impact of famine on domestic and livestock animals. But also it's important to see that actually despite of being malnourished, because there was lack of grain for not only for people but for their domestic animals as a fodder, the animals continued to be physically exploited as labor force. And they were also experiences this famine, and you can see it's very vividly on this photo. When it comes to also cattle and livestock animals, people also slaughtered these animals in order to survive, and only in the case of cows who provided people with milk, those animals were having a chance to live longer because of the practical value, because milk was really important survival resource. And in many human testimonies, we can actually see how cows became literally a family member and were particularly valued by people for it, and they even were taken the cows to their households to be able to save it from theft, but also because it was so valuable, and people would name their, as even later after the famine, their children in honor of their cows. So there's a lot of choices made around livestock animals, which of them to save or not. But it's also what it also says as both animals and human experiences, and there are lots of challenges were both for people and for animals how to live through this extreme periods of survival. And on this slide, I put a few examples of how people would manage, would cope with emotions about famine survival and their animals. For instance, in one of them, they would mention, since the very beginning, there were no dogs, no cats, all were eaten. Or another famine contemporary would say that all dogs and cats are killed and eaten, and dogs are stolen from each other. And very similar recollections, but actually what it says us is that such numerous and very similar testimonies are saying us a lot, not only about human survival, but also about domestic and livestock animals, and how those experiences forced people to rethink the role of this human-animals relationship during famines, and also they started noticing the absence of dogs and cats from their daily lives. So it was really very challenging experience for all. But also the histories of animals could tell us a lot about multi-ethnic experiences during famines. In the collection of letters of Mennonites from south of Ukraine, we can also find various references to animals, how people are making very difficult choices. On this particular slide, you can see a quote from a letter of a German family, Philip and Resina Haug, who were writing letters to their relatives in North Dakota, asking for help and explaining about their difficult situation. And in this letter, they are writing that they have nothing but only a cat, and after eating this cat, they would have no resources to sustain themselves. Also, these sources could tell us a lot about different cultural traditions and taboos, because some of these famine food choices were against different culture traditions or norms. In particular, this would be related to eating horse meat, and for many contemporaries, Ukrainians, Mennonites, eating horse meat was against cultural norms, and even starving. Some families were not able to eat horse meat, and this also says us a lot about these cultural norms and traditions that we can only see from these perspectives. Also, as I mentioned, the stories can tell us a lot about histories of violence, theft, crimes, again related to animals. And again, there are so many different references to it, and such sources are well documented by DPU and different state authorities, because they followed very closely the situation, in particular relevant to crimes, but also to like different cases where such animals became a source of violence in the countryside. And in this source, as that I would like to turn your attention, we can see how teacher from Kharkiv, Alexandra Radchenko, mentions that all dogs and cats are killed and eaten, and dogs are stolen from each other. So it was very common reference. And also there were also very interesting case in Dnipropetrovsk region documented by local authorities. It's about the case when a collective farmer stole a dog of another villager, another peasant, and later this farmer from which the dog was stolen appealed to the village council and demanded the thief punishment and requested the half of his dog that remained in possession of this person, that it should be returned to him as the owner. So this is very difficult decisions and relationship regarding animals, and the importance of even getting back a half of a dog. Certainly, it was already dead. Illustrates us the role of these animals played for human survival, and why and how it was valued. And again, we should take into account that eating dogs and cats were also against culture norms and food traditions in Ukrainian culture. So it also tells us a lot about how famine forced people to cross this culture taboos and go against this existing norms and understanding of what is edible or what's not. And again, how famine forced people to change, to rethink their relationship with their livestock and domestic animals. So this is why it's important to take this into account, to understand why in particular people ate their cats and dogs, and what does it mean for them, for their experience of famine, and later post-famine trauma, how they coped with this experience in the aftermath of famine. So here we can just make this bridge with John's presentation and how this famine experience made this like extensive impact beyond years of famine. And here again, I would like to get back to Alexandra Radchenko diary when she is mentioning again about her personal choice when she decided to give away her hunting dog because it was very expensive and she didn't have enough food to sustain her. And when a collective farmer came to her house and asked for food and for some help, she decided that it was worth giving away this dog, even it was valuable for their family and was a part of their family. And she's just saying that this dog would need to be killed anyway, and there is no food for her, so it's better to give it for this starving farmer. So they eat her. So such difficult but practical choices were done by people, and this is also says us a lot about their decisions and emotions and trauma. So looking in this case at the example of cats and dogs during the Holodomor, we can see how the importance of cats and dogs was reevaluated during the famine, how they also experienced the impact of reduced food base early on because they were considered less valuable compared to livestock animals. And they initially were the first who starved to death and were eliminated from the streets, as you can see in many references of people. And those animals like cats and dogs were submitted to the primary needs for human survival in the first stage of famine, and they became the sources of human food sustenance. And in more privileged position, if you could say so, for other animals such as livestock animals and cattle, they would be given fodder, medical care because of their practical value and importance for survival of a family. And even state paid particular attention to survival of cattle. During 1930s in particular, we were actively developing veterinary services by the Soviet state. And on this photo, you can see how the health of horses is checked by workers and peasant inspection. And in particular, state was preoccupied with the situation regarding animal epidemics and diseases, because it could be also present a danger for people. So the spread of animal diseases to people was particularly actively monitored. And again, the sources are available, and there is still so much work to be done on this area. And I started working on this topic, and the chapter about animal diseases and animal deathscapes would be also hopefully published next year. But also going beyond domestic and livestock animals, we can see how famine also impacted wild animals. So it's also this impact could be considered in the context of Soviet collectivization of agriculture, when pests, so-called wild animals that state considered as pests, were aimed to be fully eradicated from the fields, and in particular that would be related to groundhogs, gophers, and other small wild animals. In particular, very difficult fate would be related to steppe rodents. Again, looking at the human recollections about their survival experience, you could also see how many of people referred to the importance of wild animals, in particular gophers, for their survival. But also in their testimonies, other smaller wild animals are mentioned, in particular frogs, hedgehogs, shellfish, mice, rats, moles. So again, it depended on ecological zones where people were located. If it would be rivers, they would be living thanks to fish or mollusks or shellfish. In the steppe areas like east of Ukraine or south of Ukraine, people would sustain themselves thanks to wild animals like gophers and groundhogs. And looking at the scale of this impact, we can see how catastrophic was impact of survival practices of people and state eradication of pests. And in this slide, I put a few examples how you and so you can see the scale, at least in the example of one particular family that were able to catch around 100 gophers per day. So it really literally says a lot about the scale of the eradication of animals and impact of famine on them. What also wanted to say that I probably have to conclude very briefly. Animals' experiences during famine open us an opportunity to look beyond human experiences, but also acknowledge the difficult choices that people have to make in order to survive, to cross cultural taboos, to think about their emotions, to think about the trauma that such choices imposed on them. We can see how animals became sources for humans, how famine caused spread of animal epidemics, but also created enormous animal deathscapes, in addition to human deathscapes that also John has just told us about. So history of famine and animals is a history that is interconnected between people, environments, and their survival practices. It also history about the consequences of Soviet so-called modernization, as it resulted in eradication of numerous animal species and causing millions of human deaths. But the larger question that I aim to develop, to think today with all of you is to how to write about the more human experiences of famine. So in this case, I think the most important thing is to start noticing these animals in human records. It's the discussion that was developed by Gorman and Gaynor already in their article several years ago, but I think we can use this approach in a history of Holodomor and famine studies. We have to go beyond the traditional historical archive to incorporate different types of sources. In addition to textual sources and records, there's so many work to be done with visual sources like photos, images, and other types of documents. Basically, the main idea is to challenge the existing understanding of famine as only a human catastrophe and incorporate more than human histories. This is certainly challenging because all of the state records that I was just mentioning about, they are created by humans, by people, by state. But I still think there is a way how we can write about history of famine in more critical way, and to introduce environmental and ecological objects, and different interdisciplinary approaches would certainly be very helpful in this context. And also in this, while writing and thinking about more than human experience of famine, as I mentioned at the beginning, the most important challenge is to find a language how to write ethically about human sufferings and about animal experiences, and how to find proper words, proper thoughts, how even to think about this. And especially, again, coming back to the present day, as we see how how Russia's aggression against Ukraine are impacting both people and animals, I think it's also approaches should be applied to history of famines, where can be actually start noticing the large-scale impact of famines on non-human animals. And this, I think, would allow us to think about famines as shared and multi-species catastrophe. This is approach that I'm trying to introduce also in my research. And you can see here the list of different publications, and one of them is my forthcoming book on famine in Soviet Ukraine, Ecology, Materiality, and Memories of Survival, that I hope will be available next year. And I'm grateful to my colleagues with whom I worked on this topic very closely, such as Daria Cymbaluk and Tanya Richardson. The article on animal-sensitive history will be available at forthcoming issue of Journal of East-West. This issue was particularly developed for going beyond anthropocentrism in Ukrainian studies. And about animal escapes would be also available, I think, later this year. So thank you so much again for your attention, and I'm looking forward for questions and further discussion.
Thank you so much, Iryna, for your great presentation. I would say that I have read your article about this animal sensitivity approach and non-humans at the Holodomor, and I think it's amazing. So I guess everyone should read those articles for sure. Thank you for bringing this non-human angle to the history of the Holodomor, and also for sharing your ideas how and why we need to include environment and non-humans in our studies and our research. So I guess during this seminar you found all answers on your questions why environment matter and why we need to study not only humans but also non-humans, and also how humans interacted with environment. So thank you so much to you, Iryna and John, for joining us today at this seminar. It's always a pleasure to work with you and to have such a engaging and inspiring conversation. Unfortunately, on such a tragic story of Ukraine's history, but still, thank you for that. So, since this is a concluding seminar of our seminar series, or I would say the concluding seminar of the cycle of the seminars, so I would like to thank all of our partners, first of all. Special thank you is going to Yulia Malitska and Alexey Chebotaryov, my colleagues in and FHISTA research group. Thank you, Yulia and Alexei, for those engagement and enthusiasm to take actions to build the field of environmental history, despite all of the conditions and different stuff. Yeah, thank you for that. Also, I would like to thank Natalia Khanenko-Friesen, the director of Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, for enthusiasm and for support of the idea to include environment in Ukrainian studies. And also I would like to thank Stefka and Jen, who is the organizer and technical support for all of our seminars. So thank you so much, and thank you, our audience, thank you for your engagement. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for coming to our seminars, and I would say see you some other time at our another seminars on Ukraine's environment.